When we hear the word neighbor, we normally think of somebody that lives next door, maybe across the street, or at least somebody that lives nearby. Now that's not all bad. As a matter of fact, if you looked up the word neighbor in an English dictionary, you would find that it means, quote, a person living near or next door. However, when you get to the scripture, it's used in a little different sense. Perhaps the classic illustration of that is when Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, in the context, the Samaritans were just absolutely hated people by the Jews because they were half-breeds. And here this fella is laying on the side of the road being clobbered by somebody, and he's wounded, and the priest comes by and doesn't stop and help, and then the Good Samaritan comes along. Well, the Samaritan, he didn't live next door. I mean, the guy in the ditch didn't live next door. He didn't live across the street. He didn't live nearby. And yet Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan in answer to the question, who is my neighbor? So that takes the concept of neighbor way beyond somebody living next door or down the street. In that parable, the neighbor is somebody you don't even know, and certainly nobody that lives close to you. Now, we've been going through the book of Proverbs, and in Proverbs, it's also used in a variety of different ways. The Hebrew word that's translated neighbor means friend, intimate, companion, fellow citizen, or just another person. And of course, as with all words, the exact meaning is determined by the context. So what I want us to do today is look at the neighbor in the book of Proverbs. And we'll look in some passages elsewhere, but primarily just what is the concept of neighbor in the book of Proverbs. Now, as compared to all the other topics that we've covered in this series, this one is a little different. In this series, we've talked about the righteous, the wicked, the wise, the fool, the simpleton, the scorner. The book of Proverbs talks about a whole bunch of other kinds of people as well. But this is different. In all of those other discussions, we were told that we needed to know about those kind of people. In this case, we are told about how to treat these people called neighbors. So in that sense, this is a little different. So what I'm going to do is go through the various passages in the book of Proverbs that talks about neighbor. Now, some of what I'm about to say is simple. Matter of fact, some of what I'm about to say you already know. But hang with me, because there are some things in the book of Proverbs about neighbor that are much more complicated than that. So before we get to the end of this little investigation, we're going to see some comments about neighbor that are a little more complex than just the simple stuff we already know. So with that in mind, let's look at what the scripture says about neighbor in the book of Proverbs. Turn with me to Proverbs chapter 3. Now, let me suggest that we need to look at verses 27 through 33. 27 says, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power or in your hand to do so. Do not say to your neighbor, 'Go and come back, and tomorrow I will give it.'" Now notice that verse 27 doesn't use the word neighbor, but verse 28 does. And obviously it's talking about the same kind of person. So those two verses are talking about neighbor. Look at verse 29. "Do not devise evil against your neighbor, for he dwells by you for safety's sake. Do not strive with a man without a cause.
if he has done you no harm. Do not envy the oppressor and choose none of his ways, for the perverse person is an abomination to the Lord, but his secret counsel is with the upright. The curse of the Lord is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the house of the just. Now, if you look at these verses, you will see that in one sense he's talking about several different kinds of people, and yet in another sense it could be said that there are 4 commands up to verse 31, and they in a sense are all talking about the neighbor. The first 2 mentions the neighbor. The 3rd command talks about a man, the 4th about oppressor, but it seems to me that all of these are in essence talking about the neighbor. So what I'm going to suggest is this. Verse 27 says, do not withhold good from those for whom it is due, when it is in your power of your hand to do so. So here's the first thing you need to know about how to treat a neighbor. It says in verse 27, do not withhold good. So, simply put, you need to do good to your neighbor, whoever that might be. Now, there's some things about that he says in this verse, like, from those to whom it is due. Interesting. Do good, and you think you're just out of the kindness of your heart doing a favor to somebody, but this proverb seems to suggest that it's more than that. It's a duty. It's not optional. It's an obligation. There may be exceptions, but this verse seems to be saying it's due him. So it is our obligation to do good to a neighbor. He says if it's in your power, then it is your duty to do good to that person. Then he says in verse 28, do not say to your neighbor, go and come back, and tomorrow I will give it. Now he's still talking about doing good, only what he's adding is, and don't delay, don't procrastinate. Don't say, well, come back tomorrow and I'll do good to you. If it's within your power to do it, he says, do it now. Delay is a form of denial. Delay is a form of disobedience. So he not only says do good, he says do it when you have the opportunity. It is your duty to do good to other people. Called the neighbor, but neighbor in the book of Proverbs is just about anybody that you come in contact with. Now, he says some other things in this passage that I think are related, at least to some degree. For example, he says in verse 30, do not strive with a man without cause if he has done you no harm. So part of doing good to a neighbor is don't strive with him. And the word strive means quarrel. Don't enter into a dispute. In the context of doing good, it's that you simply don't quarrel. He says, if he has done you no harm. So don't pick a quarrel with anybody. The idea of harm means evil or badness or even just unpleasantness. So doing good is you just don't argue with people. Someone has said we destroy relationships over insignificant issues. A listener called a counselor on a talk show to get advice concerning a dispute over a piece of jewelry. As they talked, it became apparent that the listener was going to have to choose between a relatively inexpensive piece of jewelry and a good relationship with a relative. The counselor opted for the relationship. When the listener wanted to argue with the counselor said, what is of more value, the material item or the relationship? We often quarrel about things that are of no significance or value, and in the process damage the relationship. So do good, and part of that is don't strive, don't quarrel. Now I'm going to jump down to verse 31, where he says, do not envy the oppressor or choose none of his ways. And the word oppressor means don't do violence. It's used of language, it's used of harsh treatment, and it's used of physical violence. So he says, don't envy the oppressor. Now, why would you ever want to envy an oppressor? That sounds a little odd. If he's an oppressor, you don't envy him. Well, it's probably not talking about the person, but it's probably talking about that person's possessions, or that person's power, or that person's position. You don't envy those characteristics of that person who is an oppressor. And in verse 32, he gives the reason. For the perverse person is an abomination to the Lord, but his secret counsel is to the upright. You don't want to envy that kind of a person, because regardless of what they have in terms of possession or position, it's an abomination to the Lord. And as you've heard me say many times in this series, an abomination to the Lord is something that is disgusting to the Lord. So don't envy that kind of person. All right, I've only got 3 things to say about the neighbor, and this is the first one. And basically it is do good. And I think it is significant that it says when it is in the power of your hand to do so. If it's within your power, always do good. Don't strive with people. Don't envy them. Do good to them. Over my lifetime, I'm not sure how many sermons I've heard, surely hundreds. Would you ever guess how many sermons you've heard in your life? Would you say you've heard 1,000? Depends on how long you've been a Christian and attending church, but most of us would have heard hundreds and hundreds of sermons, right? How many of them do you remember? I'm not sure I remember many of the ones I've preached, much less the ones I've heard. I've actually had people say to me something like, do you remember that sermon you preached a few weeks ago? And I didn't. That's bad. But one of the most memorable sermons I've ever heard that had a great impact on my thinking, I've never forgotten it, was one that was preached by my mentor, who was a professor named Haddon Robinson. And he preached in chapel. Now, this was many decades ago, but he preached on the Good Samaritan. And he had a theory of preaching that you should boil it down to one single simple sentence and drive that home, and he did it with great gusto. And here was his sentence. The question that provoked that parable was somebody asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Dr. Robinson went through that passage, and he then said the point is your neighbor is anybody whose need you see, whose need you can meet. Think about that. Your neighbor is not just somebody who lives next door or across the street or down the block. Your neighbor is anybody whose need you see, whose need you're able to meet. That's an exact quote from that sermon. It was so embedded in my head, I've never forgotten it. Now, with that in mind, look at Proverbs 3:27. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is within your power, the power of your hand, to do so, which is just exactly what Haddon Robinson said about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Your neighbor is anyone whose need you see, whose need you're able to meet. So the first point in the book of Proverbs is that you should do good to your neighbor. There is a second point. Turn to Proverbs chapter 3, where we should be, and look at the verse I skipped. Look at verse 29. Do not devise evil against your neighbor, for he dwells by you for safety's sake. Now, the first thing I think Proverbs teaches about your neighbor is do good. The second thing Proverbs teaches about your neighbor is do no harm. Now, I told you at the beginning that some of the things I was going to say about the neighbor were simple. And the first two are, and this is a case in point. You already knew before you came to this service today or listened to it, you already knew that you shouldn't do harm, right? Of course. So I'm not going to beat this horse to death, but I am going to ride it for a little bit, because I want to look at the Proverbs that say that. It's interesting. This is a case in point. 3:29 simply says, do not devise an evil against your neighbor. Now, to say do good to your neighbor and not do it is a sin of omission. You omitted doing something you should have done. In this case, it's what is called the sin of commission. It's something you do. So not doing the good is omission. Doing evil is commission. And of course, he says you should not do that. And in this case, he uses the word neighbor and says this is the one who feels safe near you. Look at verse 29. Do not devise evil against your neighbor, for he dwells by you for safety's sake. He thinks he's safe near you. Now, that doesn't mean he lives next door, but just in your relationship with you, he feels safe. So don't devise evil against him. Now, that's the general principle. But the reason I want us to talk about this a little bit is the book of Proverbs talks about our relationship to our neighbor, and it gives specifics. So let me put it like this. If I said to you, don't harm anybody, what does that mean? What would you say are the specifics? Well, I guess you would do no physical harm, right? You wouldn't rob them, right? That's a good list. What does Proverbs say? If it were going to list specifics of not harming, what list would it give? Well, I will show you. Look at chapter 6, verse 27. Can a man take fire to his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Can one walk on hot coals and his feet not be seared? So it is with he goes to his neighbor's wife. Whoever touches her shall not be innocent. In the context of the book of Proverbs, it says don't do harm, and it specifically says don't commit adultery with your neighbor's wife. That, I think, would go under the category of doing harm. Only what he says is that's harming your neighbor, but it's also harming you. And he uses the illustration of fire and says you can't take fire to your bosom and your clothes not be burned. You can't walk on coals without burning your feet. So it's impossible to participate in this sin without suffering the consequences. The punishment is inescapable. Now, I'm not going to labor this because just a few weeks back, I spoke on what the book of Proverbs says about sexual immorality. I do remember that one. At any rate, what I remember is I got to the end and said something about sex is like fire, that fire in its place is beneficial. You take it out of its place and it's destructive. You put fire in the fireplace, it warms you. You put fire in the stove and it cooks your food. You put fire outside of those things and it burns the house down. Well, that's a biblical analogy, and it's in chapter 6. He specifically says, fire in your bosom will burn you. And he's talking about sexual immorality. Or let me give you another illustration. Look at chapter 24, verse 28. Do not be a witness against your neighbor without cause, for who you would deceive with your lips. Do not say, I will do to him just as he has done to me. I will render to the man according to his work. Now, don't commit adultery is one form of doing harm. The other is bearing false witness. So he says, do not be a witness against your neighbor. And most commentators think that this is probably talking primarily about being a false witness in court, though it probably has application beyond that. In this case, he says, don't witness against your neighbor without cause. That is, don't say something against your neighbor that is groundless, about which you have no proof. Don't deceive. And then he goes on to say, don't say I'm going to do to him what he did to me. That is, don't do this out of revenge. Don't bear false witness. Then he says in 25:18, a man who bears false witness against his neighbor is like a club, a sword, and a sharp arrow. That's 25:18. He says to lie against somebody, to bear false witness against them, is like a club, a sword, or a sharp arrow. The Hebrew word translated club means hammer, and one commentator said it probably means sledgehammer. Interesting, the analogy. To bear false witness against somebody is like taking a hammer and hitting them in the head. Then he says it's like a sword. So you cut them, maybe kill them. Or like a sharp arrow, you wound them, or maybe do them in. So a false witness is destructive. It says destructive to a person's reputation as a weapon is to their body. That's the analogy. So someone has said, would you not be horrified at the thought of beating your neighbor's brains out with a hammer? You would. You'd be horrified at that. And yet you would say something against them that is not true. Destroying their reputation, and therefore just like taking a hammer, a sword, or an arrow and wounding them. So this is the picture of cruelty and malice, and even in intentionally murdering somebody. The book of Proverbs talks about the tongue doing very good. In this place, the tongue is a weapon. It's a weapon of death. What is that old thing we used to say when we were kids? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words would never help me. Remember that? When you were a kid? Is that true? No. Sticks and stones may break your bones, and words can definitely hurt you. I got Bible on that. I got a verse for that, and I just gave it to you. It's Proverbs 25:18. Sticks and stones break bones, and so do clubs and swords and arrows. And that's just like what happens when you tell a lie against somebody. There's one other thing in this category of do not harm. Don't commit adultery with the person's wife. Do not bear false witness against a person. And the other is don't deceive anybody. Look at 26:19. Like a madman who throws firebrands, arrow, and death is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, I was only joking. Again, we've looked at this particular proverb before, but this time I'm looking at it because it specifically mentions neighbor. So the point of this is if you deceive your neighbor, you're like a man throwing a firebrand, an arrow, and death. It's like setting off a car bomb in front of the buildings in Nashville. You're going to throw a firebrand. You're going to cause destruction and death when you're deceiving that person. So do no harm. That is the point. By the way, there's probably a little progression in this verse. It says you throw a firebrand, then an arrow, and then death. And the climax of the progression is death. You could actually kill somebody, if not them personally, certainly their reputation, by deceiving them. So he says, do no harm. I think that's the overriding point. And in this case, the person says, I was only joking. It can do just as much damage if you did it intentionally and seriously, which seems to be the point. Proverbs 29:5 says, a man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. A man who flatters his neighbor. We're still talking about deception. The word flattery, this is really interesting. The Hebrew word for flattery means smooth and slippery. You ever heard of a smooth talker? You're usually implying he's deceiving you. So this flatterer is a smooth talker, but he spreads a net for his own feet. And again, the idea is don't harm somebody by what you do or by what you say. Do not bear false witness and do not deceive. Now, the point of all of this is do no harm. The principle is stated in chapter 3. These other passages give specifics, but the point is do no harm. Now, where have you heard that all your life? The Hippocratic Oath? The doctor, do no harm. Well, just because I decided to call this do no harm, and I thought, well, I'm going to tell everybody you need to take the Hippocratic Oath. So raise your right hand. And then I thought, well, before I do that, maybe I should look this up. So on the Harvard Medical School website, it says this, and I quote, while some medical schools ask their graduates to abide by the Hippocratic Oath, others use a different pledge, and some none at all. And in fact, although first do no harm is attributed to the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, it isn't part of the Hippocratic Oath. What? I've heard that all my life. According to the Harvard Medical website, it's not. They say, quote, it is actually from another of his works called, you ready for this? Of the Epidemics. Isn't that interesting? So when there's an epidemic, do no harm. Now, I'm suggesting that whether it's in the Hippocratic Oath or not, we ought to take the oath of do no harm. Now, I said at the beginning that some of these things I were going to say is pretty simple. You know them, and we've covered two of them. Do good, do no harm. Got it? Then I said it's going to get interesting. It's going to get a little complex. And that's what's next. Now I'm going to talk about some specific things that you have to do with the relationship with your neighbor. And I'm going to put them all under the general umbrella of be wise. In some of your relationships with other people, you just need to be wise. Now that's the general principle. Let me give you the specifics. This is going to get a little interesting. Look at Proverbs 6, verse 1. My son, if you become surety for your friend, and that's the Hebrew word neighbor, if you have shaken hands in pledge for a stranger, you are snared by the words of your mouth. You are taken by the words of your mouth. These verses are talking about security, surety. We would say co-signing. That is precisely what this is talking about. That is, you are assuming the responsibility for a debt of someone else. The responsibility of the debt, if the borrower defaults, is the idea. And it says you're going to shake hands. They used to, in this country, shake hands, and that was as good as a contract. That's no longer true. Sometimes the contract isn't even as good as it should be. But the idea is you're under contract. You've made a contract with this person. So this proverb is saying, be careful. Because what you do, if you're doing that, is if you co-sign for a loan, you've entered a snare. And the snare means being trapped, like an animal in a trap. It says you've been taken, and the idea is you've been captured. So that if you co-sign, there is the possibility that if the person you co-sign for defaults, then you have to pay, and you have been trapped. So be smart, be wise, be careful. Interesting. Could cause stress. Could damage your own credit. So when it comes to co-signing, he says you could be in a snare. Or look at verses 3 through 5 of the same chapter, chapter 6. So do this, my son, and deliver yourself, for you have come into the hand of your friend, and that's the Hebrew word for neighbor. Go and humble yourself and plead with your friend. Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. Deliver yourself from the gazelle, from the hand of the hunter, and the bird from the hand of the fowler. All right, he said, and the point of this is, get out of it as quick as you can. If once you're in that snare, get out of it. Don't sleep. Get out of it. Humble yourself. By the way, that's a particularly interesting word. The word, it means to stomp or tread. It was used to describing someone throwing to the ground and in a stomping manner. So he's saying, look, do whatever you have to do. Just get out of this as quick as you can. He says, plead with your friend. Don't go to sleep. Get out of this financial situation. Plead. The idea is, can even be boisterous. It has that little nuance. So you're adamant. Get out of this co-signing situation. Now, there are other proverbs that say something similar. The idea is, don't do this. It's a snare. So look at 11:15. He who is surety for a stranger will suffer, but he who hates being surety is secure. If you get in, you're going to suffer. But if you hate it, you're going to be better off. Or look at 17:18. A man devoid of understanding shakes his hand in a pledge and becomes surety for his friend. Again, if you co-sign for somebody, you're devoid of understanding. Look at 22:26. Do not be one who shakes his hand in a pledge, one who is surety for debts. This is the ultimate. He just flat out says, do not do this. So, when it comes to co-signing, be careful. It's a snare. If the person you're co-signing for defaults, you're going to suffer. So eventually he just says, don't do it. Now, if that's not interesting enough, keep reading. Look at Proverbs 11:15. 11:15. He who is surety for a stranger will suffer, but he who hates being surety is secure. Now, we saw that just a minute ago. But look at the next verse, verse 16. A gracious woman retains honor, but a ruthless man retains riches. What? In verse 15, he says, don't do it. In verse 16, the implication is, but be gracious. What? I told you this is going to get interesting. Look at Proverbs 17:18. A man devoid of understanding shakes his hand in a pledge and becomes surety for his friend. But look at the verse just before it, verse 17. A friend, that's our Hebrew word for neighbor, loves at all times, and a brother is born of adversity. So you put these verses together in juxtaposition, and he's saying, be loving, practice love, be generous, help a friend in need, co-sign for a loan. What? I thought you just stood up there and said, don't do it. It's a snare. You're going to suffer. And now you turn around and suggest that there are passages that seem to be saying, do it. I told you it was going to get interesting. Look at 20:16. Take the garment of one who is surety for a stranger and hold it as a pledge when it is for a seductress. Now he says, look, if you're going to do this, get a pledge. Now, what he's saying is, if you're going to co-sign, get some collateral. Don't just do it without collateral. Now, I need to insert here that according to the book of Exodus, this doesn't apply to a fellow Israelite. That you can co-sign for a brother and you don't need collateral. But he says if it's a stranger, get some collateral. Look at 27:13. Take the garment of him who is surety for a stranger and hold it in pledge when he is surety for a seductress. And he says in verse 26 of chapter 22, do not be one who shakes his hand in a pledge of one who is surety for a debt, if you have nothing with which to pay, which you should take away your bed from under you. The point is, be careful. If you co-sign for somebody, you could lose your bed. In other words, if they default, you're going to have to pay and you could lose. Have I confused you so far? A little bit. What book are we studying? Proverbs. Have I taught you nothing? That Proverbs are not law, they are proverbs. So I think the sum of what I've said is this. Sometimes you ought not do it. And sometimes you ought to do it. And if you're going to really be smart, you will have some collateral. You'll have some kind of assurance that the person that you're doing this with is going to be able to pay you back, or at least pay off the loan. So get some collateral. Now, based on all these verses in Proverbs, that's my conclusion. Okay? That sometimes you should do it, and sometimes you shouldn't. There's a passage in Proverbs that says, answer a fool according to his folly. Remember that? You ever heard that verse? You know what the next verse says? Don't answer a fool according to his folly. What? What's the point? Sometimes you should answer a fool according to his folly. And sometimes you should not answer a fool according to his folly. So when it comes to co-signing, sometimes you should do it and sometimes you shouldn't. It depends on the situation. And that's why I'm saying the point is, be wise. I heard a financial planner once suggest that if you co-sign, sort of decide without telling the person that this is a gift. And I thought that was very smart. So that do it so that if it defaults, you can consider it a gift. And that way,
you're doing it with money that isn't going to hurt you. So I certainly think there are times to practice co-signing. Just be wise. Now, frankly, I personally have benefited from this. When I was going through school, I had a friend who dropped out because he got in debt. And I decided I was not going to get in debt till I finished school, 8 years of it. And I didn't. So when I finally graduated and was ready to get a credit card, I thought I had perfect credit. Guess what? I had no credit. And so somebody co-signed for me to buy a car for which I was deeply grateful. So there are times to do that. Just be wise. Let me give you another specific. Look at Proverbs 28, verse 8. Do not go hastily to court, for what will you do in the end when your neighbor has put you to shame? Debate your case with your neighbor, and do not disclose the secret to another, lest he who hears you expose your shame and your reputation be ruined. This is talking about lawsuits. In your relationship with your neighbor, your friend, your relative, remember that word is broad. It applies to all of those situations. Don't go hastily into a lawsuit. And his reasoning here is because in the lawsuit, you might get embarrassed. So don't go hastily to court. Rather, if possible, go deal with it. Matter of fact, look at Matthew chapter 18. If you have a problem with a brother, the first thing you ought to do is go deal with it privately. Secondly, take somebody with you, and then later take it to the believers in an assembly. But don't go to court. As a matter of fact, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 says you should suffer the loss rather than go to court with a brother. Samuel Johnson is one of the great literary figures of English literature. Matter of fact, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography says he's arguably the most distinguished man of letters in English history. I think that is arguable, but anyway. Somebody wrote his biography, and here's what Samuel Johnson said. A man who deliberates about going to law should have 1, a good cause. 2, a good purse. Takes money to hire a lawyer. 3, a good skilled attorney. 4, good advice. 5, good counsel. 6, a good upright judge. Good luck. 7, a good intelligent jury. Good luck. Those are my editorial comments. And all these things on his side if he has not. Then he says, number 8, good luck. It is odds that he miscarriages in his suit. And then he says, oh, glorious uncertainty of the law. I love it. Be careful about going to law. One more. You'll love this. Look at 25:17. Solemn set your foot in your neighbor's house, lest he become weary of you and hate you. I'm saying in your relationship with your neighbor, whoever that might be careful, be wise about co-signing, be careful about going to court, and be careful about going to visit. That's what he says. Actually, the word solemn here means to be prized or to be precious. It's equivalent to being highly valued. In other words, visits should be valuable and limited in order to avoid being a nuisance. It's important, one author says, to know when to leave. Good advice. You can overstay your welcome. I once knew a fella who was a medical doctor, and at one point in his life he was a missionary, and a very godly man. He was an elder in his church. And he said to me one day, when you go visit relatives, limit it to 3 days. And I thought, there's some wisdom to that. At any rate,
Solomon says, make it short and make it infrequent. You can wear out the visit. All right, how are we doing? Was this interesting or what? All right, here, let me sum it up and wind it up. The way to relate to your neighbor, according to the book of Proverbs, is do good, don't do harm, and in a lot of situations, just be smart. Be careful. Now, as I studied all of this, something occurred to me, and that is, I want you to turn to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13, one of my favorite passages on this subject. But I want you to look at Romans 13, and I want you to look at verse 8. This sort of ties some of these things together. He says in verse 8, owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. All right. That fits the point I made about just go do good. All right? But what he says is, if you just do good, you will fulfill the law. And then he says this in verse 9, for the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, they're all summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now think about it. If you love, you're going to do good. If you love, you're not going to commit adultery with the neighbor's wife. If you love, you're not going to steal their property. If you love, you're not going to bear false witness. It's all summed up in go love your neighbor. Jesus said the greatest commandment is love God, and the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. So you don't have to live by law, live by the rule of love. Just go love your neighbor. That means do what's best for them. And if you do what's best for them, then you're going to do them no harm. Now, having said that, I need to add one little itty-bitty thing. Some people get it in their heads that you just go love everybody, and they get themselves in trouble. So we need to balance Romans 13 with Galatians chapter 6. So turn to this one last passage, and I'm done. Galatians chapter 6 says this, verse 2, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. What's the law of Christ? Love. Bear one another's burdens. Go help people. Go do good to people. That's love. That's what the Lord wants us to do. Keep reading. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. For each one shall bear his own load. Huh? Did you see that? Look at verse 2. Bear one another's burdens. Look at verse 5. Bear your own burden. Did you see that? Sounds as confusing as neighbor in the book of Proverbs, doesn't it? So this, I think, really puts the whole thing in perspective. I heard someone explain this passage once by saying that what the difference here is this. Everybody should bear their own load. That's the normal capacity of a ship. But when it says bear one another's burdens, the idea is the ship is overloaded. So when the ship is overloaded, help them. But don't do something that they should do for themselves. Sum up, go do good. Go love people. That's what the Lord wants us to do. Don't harm them, but be wise in some of the ways you help them. Or as a modern psychologist would say,
Don't be an enabler, but love and help when it is within your power to do so. Father, thank you for granting us the possibility of loving because you have loved us and taught us to love. Now give us the grace and the insight and the wisdom to do that appropriately so that we can glorify you. In Jesus' name.